This is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. We're picking up from the beginning of chapter 3, so that is page 61 of the translation. The title of this chapter is The Space of Behavior and Axiological Space. To give like a brief recap of the last chapter, the last chapter was on framing activities and framed mechanisms. So this was sort of the duality that he describes in terms of the origin of a mechanism, to put it in different terms. So you have some sort of process, like he describes this man in the middle system with like an anti-aircraft gun. You have a radar or some sort of sensor, whatever, doesn't really matter. At one end of this system or this chain, you have some sort of transmission, wires or radio signal, whatever it is, being sent back to a control station. And then you have a person, an operator watching this radar screen, and then making a decision of some kind. Is this dot on the screen an enemy plane that's attacking our base, or is it just a flock of geese going by? And then based on that decision, they will send a command of some kind, again, through whatever system, cables or radio transmission, to an anti-aircraft gun, which turns and fires or whatever. Doesn't really matter exactly what it does, but in any case, you have this system where the person, this conscious being that makes decisions, is in the middle, and then you have the input and output ends are machines of different kinds. So here we have the machines are framing the person who is framed. And this type of chain where the person making a decision is in the middle is framed by the machines. In this type of chain, you can, in principle, you can replace the person by a machine of some kind. So it may be that, with the state of technology, like especially when he's talking about the 1950s, it might not be feasible to, produce a machine that gives the same performance as a person, or, maybe it's just too expensive to do it, or the machine isn't reliable or whatever. But in principle, this is something you can always do. You can always have like some sort of mechanical or electronic, whatever device that analyzes the incoming radar signal and determines whether it's a plane or a flock of birds, and then sends the appropriate command to the anti-aircraft gun. But what Ruyer points out in this chapter is that this whole chain, whether you have a person in the middle or not, is itself framed by decisions of humans, conscious human beings. So you have someone who decides, this location is, a potential target of enemy aircraft, so we should set up a radar installation and anti-aircraft gun in this location as opposed to some other location. So there's like a decision that this is, where to set up this whole chain from the radar to the operator to the anti-aircraft gun. And then even, going sort of zooming out even further, you could have like, that someone made a decision that, defending the borders of this country or setting up anti-aircraft defenses in general is, something that we should do, et cetera. You can just keep zooming out further and further. But any sort of chain of these machines, whether there's a person in the middle or not, in principle, you can always sort of zoom out one step further and look at, a person deciding to make that chain in the first place. And so this is sort of like the contrast between machines for Ruyer and the conscious human being. A machine is always put together or set up or instituted by a person. It doesn't so even when you have, say, like a factory for building machines, even if that factory is like automated, there's still someone who had to decide, let's build this automated factory in the first place. So it's in principle, it's always possible to keep sort of zooming out or keep going back one step further in the chain until you arrive at a person who set up that machine or that series of machines. So the machines are not autonomous in that sense, that the machines don't sort of produce themselves. Even if you have like in a sort of subordinate sense, you have machines that are producing other machines. There's still, at some point going back in the chain, there's still a person who decided to set up this whole system of machines producing machines. whereas persons or human beings, living beings in general, do produce themselves or produce the sequence of living beings. So you have parents that produce a child organism, but you don't have to sort of go back from a living being to some other type of entity that would decide to create living beings. We're sort of abstaining from a sort of creationist hypothesis that there would be like a divine being that created the whole series of living beings. We're just sort of staying within the realm of the observable universe, where living beings are always produced by other living beings. So this is sort of the contrast between machines and living beings in general. And actually, for Ruyer, he has these sort of, well, he doesn't really talk about it that much in this book, but these a little bit speculative hypotheses about how even subatomic particles would be essentially analogous to a living being and to a conscious being. So there's this kind of like directedness or I don't know, inner life, I guess, of an electron, and then a living being would be somehow sort of like a larger version of this, or like sort of reproducing the same kind of thing at a larger scale. In contrast to a machine, which of course is made up of electrons and protons and so on at some level, but it doesn't sort of reproduce that inner nature or that inner life. At the machine scale, it's just sort of a mechanical sequence. Like the whole point of a machine is to ensure that it operates in a sort of predictable way that with a given set of inputs and sort of background conditions, it will produce a predictable output. So it sort of prevents the like inner life side of things from being manifested. So this is sort of the contrast, like I guess at the more fundamental level is like, does the organization of this system sort of amplify this inner life of the subatomic particles, or this like inner life of matter and the world, and sort of allow it to exist at a larger scale, like in the case of living beings, or does it, on the other hand, sort of restrict that inner life side of things and ensure that the operations of this system are functioning in this predictable manner, like in the case of machines? Right. Yeah. So Angus has posted here the sort of comparison here. If you have like a marble statue, each of the particles that make up this statue has this sort of inner life for Ruyer, but the statue as such, so the fact that it has this particular shape and not another, is completely indifferent for the molecules or the particles. So like there's no sort of organization of the statue as such, where there would be sort of like an inner life of the statue as like a sort of entity that exists in its own right. You just have a bunch of different particles that are interacting with each other in the ways that particles do, that for an external observer are sort of shaped in the form of this statue, but for those particles themselves, there's no like the shape of the statue has no reality for those particles themselves, except insofar as it is sort of reflected in the ways that these particles are interacting with each other individually. And like this is also connected, like you can make some connections with some things that Fichte talks about in relation to living beings, and what it is for a subject to have a body. And he sort of contrasts the case of like a pile of sand and a tree or an animal body. The pile of sand only exists as an entity, as like a sort of delineated being, insofar as you are outside observing it. The pile of sand has no sort of unity for itself. It's only for the external observer that you can say like this pile of sand here. Whereas a tree or an animal has a certain unity for itself, that like the tree, for example, will recognize its parts of itself as parts of itself. It will sort of defend itself against insect infestations and so on. But and then of course the same thing for animals. So these are any living being is something that exists for itself and not just for an external observer. This is sort of like the in principle difference that he's insisting on here. Okay, yeah, so we can get going on the reading. So yeah, if someone can pick up from the beginning of chapter 3, please.
I can read. The space of behavior and axiological quote-unquote space. The most shocking thing about non-mechanical postulates is the invocation of a quote-unquote transspatial. Because of an ingrained prejudice, quote-unquote transspatial seems to be equivalent to quote-unquote supernatural. This prejudice is all the more unjustifiable because in physics itself, theorists increasingly use, quote, configuration spaces, unquote, which are beyond ordinary space. It is quite possible that some parts of the transspatial world may blend seamlessly into the transnatural. But as far as the area we are interested in is concerned, the transspatial must be considered as a perfectly positive hypothesis. Since the question is of utmost importance, we must insist on it and try to clarify it with schemas. According to orthodox cyberneticians as well as gestaltists, we must be able to depict any feedback in any circular process, or dynamic regulation of a gestalt, or homeostatic regulation. We have noted the close kinship of all these concepts without leaving the space-time of physicists, or at least while remaining in a quote-unquote behavioral field, Kafka, or a life space, Lewin or Levin, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, while having certain particular characteristics contrasting it with quote-unquote geographical space. In the physicist's space-time, the behavioral field or life space has in common with the latter at least the fact that it does not call upon anything transcendent, and the time only appears there as a simple dimension, the instantaneous slices of life space being always dynamically sufficient to themselves. The field of behavior, quote-unquote life space, in this conception has immediate dynamic properties. Quote-unquote history only intervenes immediately through its current dynamic effects. The same applies to intentions bearing on the future. Animal instincts, like human ideals, are neither innate nor transcendent. Apart from external factors and their disruptive effects, continuously occurring changes in the field of behavior are due exclusively to the instantaneous dynamic interactions of its parts. When the organization of these parts presents disequilibria, the field is unstable and tensions arise. The tensions, in turn, provide potential energy for the work of readjustment. In short, the regulations, whether by feedback or by gestalt and self-distribution, are not essentially different in the field of behavior or in the space of physical phenomena. In both cases, actions occur according to forces present in the field. If A, in the behavioral field, represents quote-unquote me, or more precisely my hand, and B is a distant object with a quote-unquote calling character, the distance of B from A creates a tension. This tension decreases if A and B come closer and increases in the opposite case. A and B will therefore tend in one way or another to come closer, according to the principle of least action. Of course, the way in which this decrease in tension takes place is complicated due to the fact that it is a matter of the space of behavior and not geographical space. No attraction occurs between A and B as physical objects. No object attracts my hand directly. A strong magnet only attracts it if it is holding an iron bar. The attraction is between A and B as images or psychological realities. But this complication is no different from that of industrial appliances that have a guide mechanism on which the general operation of the system is quote-unquote dependent. Psychic attraction, or the quote-unquote calling character, according to the hypothesis, produces effects directly on the field of behavior and indirectly through the medium of the dependent effector organs in the geographical field, precisely because the tension in the field of behavior can only decrease if the distance in the geographical field decreases. For both gestaltists and cyberneticians, the attraction in the behavioral field is, after all, entirely analogous to the physical phenomenon, and it is still a physical connection that unites the two fields and turns physical gestures into a set of dependent systems. The brain is a kind of machine that enables the principle of least action in a domain in which it would not naturally occur. When a baby sees an object and picks it up to put it in its mouth, there is supposed to be an instantaneous dynamic effect, only an instantaneous dynamic effect. There's no need to mention a non-actual instinct, a transcendent and protean libido, a quote-unquote meaning of the gesture, which cannot be reduced to its physical actuality. The driving force of the gesture is provided by physiological energy reserves, and its direction by nervous mechanisms or dynamisms functioning through an energetic derivation similar to that which operates the steering servo mechanism on a more powerful machine. I'm going to read the next paragraph too, because he kind of finishes this thought here, I think. Careful. Oh, wait, that's like 3 pages, isn't it? Maybe I'll just stop there.
Yeah, it seems like one of these Simondon things with like 7 thoughts just all chained one after the other.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like the basic idea here is that even though the behavioral field or life space of the Gestaltists, at least in the case of Kafka, even though it's distinct from physical space-time, and that the attraction between objects and the life space or behavioral field is not an attraction between physical objects. It still has the same kind of explanation in that all that you, in principle, need to know about the motivation for some psychologically motivated movement, like I don't know, moving to the refrigerator to get a beer, is that there is a entirely present tension between me in the behavioral field and the beer in the refrigerator in the behavioral field, and the subsequent movement to the refrigerator to get the beer is just the operation of the principle of least action, as if it were purely physical phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly. So like the Gestalt theory of behavior or account of behavior is like a more sophisticated version than like these sort of straightforward mechanistic ones. So one of the things that they point out is the way that behavior, even of like seemingly quite simple organisms, adapts to like changes in the circumstances in a way that you can't, or it's extremely implausible to assume that there would be like some preset mechanism in this organism that was like set up in advance to adapt to these strange circumstances. So like we've talked about like these experiments where they swapped the muscles that move the eye on a monkey. So like the muscle that normally would move the eye to the left is now connected to the other side of the eye, so it moves the eye to the right instead, and vice versa. So obviously it would be very implausible to think that there's like some preset mechanism in the monkey's brain, like just in case your eye muscles get switched by a surgeon, like here's how to move your eyes. But after like a fairly short amount of time, the monkey does actually adapt to this new strange setup with the eye muscles reversed and is able to track an object moving across its visual field. Now using like the opposite muscle contractions to move its eye in the right direction. And so the Gestalt theory like wants to sort of account for these types of like dynamic and flexible adaptations in terms of this field concept, rather than like a sort of preset circuit in the brain, like that would sort of be responsible for goal-directed behavior. But what Ruyer points out here, and his sort of main criticism of this, is that the Gestalt theory still is based on the supposition of a sort of physical process that brings about this sort of dynamic adaptation. So this like field of behavior would sort of be implemented by an actual physical process in the brain of the organism that would itself be a kind of reduction of tension. So in the example that you gave, Angus, about like you want your sort of goal-directed behavior is getting a beer out of the fridge. So you would have a sort of behavioral field in your apartment or home or whatever it is that would have this sort of tension of like the not having a beer tension, I guess, and then like your behavior would be sort of directed towards the reduction of that tension by moving your body towards the fridge, opening the door, etc. But this would all be brought about just by this sort of minimization of tension process in this dynamic field in your brain. Yeah, so like he points out here that of course the sort of attraction of the fridge and the beer bottle in the fridge and so on. This attraction is not a straightforward physical attraction. It's not like a gravitational force or a magnetic force on your body. It's only insofar as you are an organism that has goals, like retrieving a beer from the fridge, that there is something like this dynamic behavioral field with its tensions and so on, that brings about something like an attraction. But yeah, so the Gestalt explanation for how this comes about is that there's a kind of like coupling of some sort of dynamical system in your brain with the sort of state of the environment that sort of implements this reduction of tension within the organism that corresponds to the approximation towards the goal outside the organism, like the moving towards the fridge, opening the door, etc. So ultimately we're still talking about something that exists in space, except that now we're like, rather than just saying like there's this sort of pre-built circuit in the brain, and then you have like a sort of flow of energy from the sense organs through the circuit to the muscles in like a very sort of simplistic like a sort of reflex theory type account like we talked about in the Merleau-Ponty reading. Now we have this more sophisticated form of like physical dynamical coupling of a tension reduction within the organism that corresponds to this goal-directed behavior outside the organism. But we're still talking about there is like something in the brain of the organism or in the organism as a whole which corresponds to this behavioral field. It's still something that exists in space. Whereas what he's going to talk about in this chapter is how this is sort of insufficient to account for the kinds of things that we are interested in, and we have to talk about something that is not actually located in space and time, this transspatial realm. But he also points out here that like even as this seems sort of mysterious and even supernatural, like he says here, at the same time, like even physicists, dealing with something, a quite simple system of like thermodynamic system of like equalization of temperature or whatever, will often represent the system in terms of a state space or configuration space where like you have say like two bodies at different temperatures that come into contact and then eventually equalize their temperature. You would sort of, rather than just representing the spatial locations of these bodies and then sort of assigning a temperature variable to different locations in space, you would instead have a state space which is like a representation of the temperature as a spatial dimension, and then you would like study the trajectory of or each body's trajectory in this temperature space over time. I know that in sort of classical mechanics, for example, there's the Hamiltonian formulation where you, rather than sort of tracking the trajectories of bodies through physical space, like planets orbiting the sun or whatever, you instead for each body you have six coordinates, so three spatial dimensions and then three momentum coordinates. So you, instead of like a three-dimensional space, a physical space where you track the trajectories of the bodies, you instead have a six-dimensional space, and then each body is a point that moves in this six-dimensional space in terms of certain laws of motion that like the position and momentum at each coordinate at a given moment determine the position and momentum of that point in the next moment. So this is like a completely like normal procedure within physics, that you would sort of move away from the actual physical space, this three-dimensional space filled with bodies, to this more sort of abstract like six-dimensional space, or it could be many dimensions depending on what properties of the bodies you're interested in. So like when Ruyer is talking about this transspatial sort of orientation of living beings, we shouldn't think of it as any more mysterious than representing the mechanics of a physical system in terms of these six coordinates rather than the three spatial coordinates. Yeah, and so like Bats has put in the chat here, like if you think about even a very simple physical system of like a planet orbiting a sun, for example, if you need 6 coordinates to represent this kind of system and its development, you can it seems pretty plausible that you might need many more than 6 coordinates to represent the behavior even of like a simple animal that has like a variety of different behaviors that it can exhibit in different circumstances that are related to its environment in these complicated ways. So yeah, you would it shouldn't be surprising that we need to appeal to something similar to like a state space, this sort of non-spatial orientation of the organism to account for the complexity and the sort of dynamic flexibility of a living organism. Yeah, so yeah, just to sort of clarify some of the points discussed in that chat here. So yeah, he does. So he thinks that this Gestalt theory with the sort of dynamic, dynamic field governing behavior is an advance on the sort of simplistic reflex account of like these pre-built circuits. But at the same time, he's going to criticize it as sort of not going far enough. That it's still sort of like the fact that this is still represented as a spatial, like the behavioral field is still spatial. It's still something that exists in space and time, and has this sort of coupling with the geographic environment, like outside the organism and like independent of the organism. And he will sort of see this as not going far enough in sort of pushing beyond a purely spatial temporal representation of the control of behavior or the governing of behavior. So we have to go beyond this behavioral fields to this sort of transspatial orientation as like what and this sort of axiological space as like part of the explanation for what it is for an organism to be directed, to have goal oriented behavior, and so on.
Should we move on to the next couple pages? Someone wants to read?
Yes. Yeah, Bats, would you like to read the next one?
Yeah, I can read. It's page 63, right?
Yes.
Okay. A careful and faithful presentation of the thesis is enough to reveal its implausibility, and more importantly, which is also more interesting, to reveal the point at which the essential correction must be applied. The behavioral space can only play its role if it is given a hypergeometric and hyperphysical quote-unquote dimension. Unlike physical feedback or self-distributions, psychological and axiological feedback and self-regulations can only be conceived if they are immersed in a non-geometric quote-unquote dimension, the properties of which are irreducible to those of physical space. A quote-unquote seen object can only attract the quote-unquote hand organ if it has a meaning with regard to either a conscious or unconscious need, or an intention or instinct aimed at a non-actualized goal. On the other hand, and simultaneously, the quote-unquote distance in the psychological field from the quote-unquote hand image to the quote-unquote object image can only regulate the course of the action through psychological feedback if it is a quote-unquote seen distance, according to absolute survey. It cannot be a quote-unquote step-by-step distance in which the nervous mechanism would be regulated only by the differential dynamic effects through feedback, just like a radar controlling a DC a cannon. Moreover, the dynamics and kinematics of psychological feedback imply a hyperdimension, an axiological space, combined with space and physical dimensions. The field of behavior, and possibly its objective equivalent, which appears to us as the cortex, is not simply a kind of quote-unquote analogical machine functioning on the principle of least action, a guide table, a servo mechanism controlling the mechanics of the body. It is a quote-unquote converter between the axiological space and the physical space. What is known as consciousness is the very act of conversion. We get here a figure in which we get space-time, and below it a hyperdimension with the meaningful idea, all of this being captured by the field of behavior. A bit difficult to describe. Okay, I will continue. Therefore, we cannot schematize psychological feedback where meaning and value intervene on a single spatiotemporal level, even if this level is supposed to represent the 4 dimensions of space-time. It is essential to include the hyperdimension, the connection of which with space provides both the dynamism of meaning, controlling the expenditure of energy extracted from physiology, and the kinematic regulation of action by quote-unquote information in the non-metaphorical sense of the word. There is a contradiction in imagining that cerebral processes still obey a banal quote-unquote molar and blind dynamism, or that the field of consciousness is only a place of attraction or repulsion. I see both my hand A and the object B at the same time when I move my hand to the object. I do not only feel the quote-unquote solid dynamic release when my hand approaches the object. Moreover, the direction Richtung of the act in its aspect of geometrical movement is enveloped by its meaning, at least implicitly. Without this quote-unquote enveloping meaning, its dynamism will be only a quote-unquote monotonous function of the distance between the hand and the object, and any detour would be impossible. In the absence of meaning, it would even lose all dynamism. If I no longer know why I make a movement, the movement soon stops, unless a subconscious thematism, still charged with quote-unquote meaning, release my conscious intention. Ultimately, there must come into play an absolute survey of the situation before the auxiliary effector mechanisms, along with a combined perception of the geometric situation and the meaning, or the value achievable starting from this geometric situation. In order for it to work, a trans-actual ideal must enter the circuit of the nervous feedback. In other words, the guiding information must be something other than a stimulus. The organic system must be quote-unquote dependent, not only on its nervous apparatus, but on a trans-spatial ideal of which the cerebral feedbacks are only auxiliaries. Lastly, this trans-spatial ideal must be directly dynamic, no matter how quantitatively small this dynamism may be compared to the subordinate dynamisms that amplify its effect in the physical world. Okay, I think I can maybe stop here. This section actually reminds me a lot of the criticisms that Merleau-Ponty did to behavioralism back in the structure of behavior, and how the concept of meaning kind of comes to the fore instead of being something a posteriori. It becomes a necessity to explain behavior. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I think what he's going to develop here is that this notion that that flexible behavior of an organism, oriented towards a goal or towards realizing certain value, to try to explain it purely in terms of this dynamic behavioral field that would itself be present and spatial, won't be sufficient to account for all the sort of flexibility of that organisms are capable of. So we know that organisms, for example, are not only capable of responding to solicitation by experiences or by things that they're perceiving now, but also are capable of changing their behavior in terms of different conditions or things that they've learned and so on. So like the organism that maybe was attracted toward, like, you can think of like a simple sort of behaviorist training setup where you train an organism to, go towards the green, button, and there it gets food. So then it sort of develops a behavioral field where there's like a tension towards the green button, where it reduces its tension by getting closer to the green button. But then you can sort of reverse the setup and say that now the green button is like where it gets an electric shock or something. And then the organism would probably learn pretty quickly that what was the good direction where the food comes from is now the bad direction where the electric shock comes from. So it learns to change its dynamic field, so that there's a sort of like second order directedness of the organism, not only in terms of like what its sort of which direction of or which sort of path through space leads to a minimization of tension, but also in terms of like restructuring the mapping between the physical environment or the set of actions the organism can perform and the general sort of directedness of the organism. So like in addition to the sort of behavioral field of going in this direction towards the green button reduces the tension in the dynamic field, you also have like sort of more fundamental to that, you have the organism's general orientation towards getting food and not getting electric shocks, for example, which itself is not spatial. That like there's no, you can't sort of reduce the organism's orientation towards good things and away from bad things to a kind of behavioral field without sort of following out that concept to the point of like being vacuous. So it's this sort of what he's describing here as the axiological or transspatial or transactual orientation of the organism towards things that are good and away from things that are bad in general, that brings about the sort of transformation or the substitution of one behavioral field for another, as it sort of learns new things or as the field changes. So when the green button is switched from being the source of food to the source of electric shocks, the organism, instead of just keeping with the tension reduction behavior of going towards the green button, will quickly learn to avoid the green button, and so it's like transformed its behavioral field, but it does so in relation to this preserved orientation of avoiding pain and seeking out pleasure. And so this sort of non-actual or non-spatial orientation is what is presupposed by the fact that an organism can learn to use a different behavioral field or to acquire a different behavioral field in its relation to its environment and the set of behaviors that it's capable of performing.
Yeah, it seems like it would be difficult to explain in terms of like the principle of least action and lived space or behavioral field. Human behavior in which some very distant goal, some goal which is very distant in time, is pursued despite kind of the unpleasantness of the immediate pursuit. I'm thinking of something like somebody who signs up for like a big swimming competition, and every week trains very hard despite the unpleasantness of getting up early to swim or whatever. And the really shit, I don't know. How long did I cut out?
For me it was like 3-4 seconds, but okay, yeah.
Okay.
My end. Yeah, keep going.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my point is just, where there's a goal that's very distant in time, and, that is sort of difficult to realize in the, like, here and now, like athletic competition with intense training every week. It seems like it would be very hard to explain that in terms of reduction of tension, unless, I guess, you posit that the goal is, I guess the tension would be achieving the, doing well in the swimming competition or whatever it is. And that tension is sufficiently present and powerful now that it kind of overrides the immediate unpleasantness of the training. But yeah, it seems like it would be hard to account for on the Gestaltist point of view or the perspective on the behavioral space.
Yeah, like the Gestalt account is like most plausible for like sort of very concrete behaviors. Going to the fridge to get a beer, for example. You can sort of it seems quite plausible to sort of picture like this behavioral field overlaid over the actual spatial environment of the apartment, and sort of a tension gradient leading towards the fridge and so on. But as soon as you get like beyond this like very concrete sort of behavior, it starts to become less plausible, and also like sort of gets emptied of content. It doesn't really tell you that much to make this assertion of a behavioral field. So I'm thinking even more sort of abstract than like training for a swimming competition, but I'm thinking like a high school student decides I want to become a doctor, so they have to apply to a university, take an undergrad, apply to a med school, do med school, etc. So this is like a 7-8 year project involving, and then of course there's all these sort of subtasks of like to do this I have to pass my first year biochem course, etc. Like all these other things, like, and these like to sort of represent this as like a behavioral field overlaid on the spatial environment with like a gradient of behaviors seems pretty absurd. That like is like there's like a sort of gradient of tension, leading the person on the floor towards the shelf in the library with the textbook for their first year biochem class or whatever. Like, yeah, this doesn't really seem like a plausible way of representing what is going on when a person is directing their behavior in terms of a goal of becoming a doctor. And like you said, like many of the like sort of subtasks of this that are required to achieve that goal would themselves be pretty arduous. That like you might spend hours studying the periodic table or like different very like difficult chemical formulas, etc. That like this is something that you find difficult. You have to sort of force yourself to do it. It's not in any way like a minimization of tension to sort of direct yourself towards this like boring textbook that you have to stare at for hours. Yeah, so like, but you sort of push yourself to do this thing that is intrinsically difficult and unpleasant because you know that this task that you have to achieve is a prerequisite for getting to the ultimate goal of becoming a doctor. So yeah, this sort of like capacity to accept like to engage in something that is unpleasant in itself for the purpose of achieving a goal that you think is worth undertaking this unpleasant task. That itself is also hard to explain. Like, how do you, and even like the much more simple behaviors, like the ones that Merleau-Ponty talked about with like the cat navigating the spiral maze, for example, where the problem that the cat runs into, depending on the orientation of the spiral, is like the fact that it has to move away from the goal temporarily to be able to turn around the spiral and get closer in the long run to the goal. And if the spiral is moving inwards with the goal at the center, the cat is able to accept and sort of allow itself to move away from the goal because it can recognize that sort of detour is getting it closer to the goal. But then if the spiral is in the opposite direction, where the cat is in the center and the goal is at the outside, it each loop around the spiral is taking it further and further away until it ultimately gets out of the spiral and can reach the goal. And the cat is not able to sort of I guess suppress that like increase of tension in moving away from the goal long enough to actually reach that goal. But in the first setup where the goal is at the center, the cat is able to suppress that increase of tension, or like not respond to the increase of tension involved in going around a loop of the spiral, because at a sort of larger scale, that loop is actually getting it closer to the goal. And so this is already hard to explain. Like, this is not like a extremely sophisticated behavior, but it's already hard to explain if you think of this behavioral field as like a sort of directing the organism in the sort of straightforward sense that the Gestalt psychologists are depicting it as. It seems like we instead have to sort of depict the cat as being directed by this non-spatial orientation towards the goal. Like, I mean, normally it's a food source of some kind. So the cat has this sort of axiological orientation that getting food is good. And this sort of orientation towards this value of eating food is what governs the cat's ability to suppress that sort of attraction towards the goal temporarily, because it can sort of use that detour to actually get closer to the goal after going around the spiral. So yeah, even like these quite simple behaviors that organisms that we don't think of as like especially cognitively sophisticated are capable of, these are already hard to like make sense of in terms of this like behavioral field with attention minimization sort of governing the animal's behavior.
The point that he made at the top of 64, or at the beginning of the second paragraph, where he says that I don't feel a solid dynamic release when my hand approaches the object. It's not like when I'm going to the fridge to get the beer, I feel better and better. The closer I get to the refrigerator, it it sort of seems like on this account you would be able to use the behavioral field as a kind of dowsing rod and just kind of wander around the city to figure out what it was that you really wanted to do, because you'd feel better as you got closer to it.
Although to be fair, I do actually sometimes use something like that mechanism where I'm like trying to decide between two things, and I just like wait to see like if the light turns green in one direction, I'll go this way, and if it goes green in the other direction, I'll go that way. Like anyway, it's kind of like a decision reduction algorithm, I guess. But yeah, so like obviously if you're like in the desert wandering around trying to find water, then like your behavioral field minimization of tension of like I need to get water, like going towards water will reduce my tension. This doesn't really help you find the water if you don't know where it is in the first place. Unfortunately, it would be nice if we could use a dowsing rod and the behavioral field to identify where the underground spring is or whatever. But also like I think some of these examples, like even the cat example, but especially the things like training for a swimming competition or deciding you want to become a doctor, like these examples where the behavior that gets you towards the goal is much more abstract and much less sort of tied to a certain spatial setup. So not only is it like less plausible to think that like the student who wants to become a doctor has like a little path, taking them to the registrar's office and like the shelf at the university bookstore where they have to get the textbook for their class or whatever, like that's already like pretty implausible. But even if you do sort of bite the bullet and say yes, like there is this little like gradient of the behavioral field that like directs the student throughout their whole trajectory of undergrad and med school. Even if you do bite the bullet and accept that, like you've sort of emptied the theory of any like meaning, because anything like any possible behavior obviously involves some sort of movement in space, even if it's like moving your hand to write a novel or whatever. And so like if any single possible behavior is just minimization of tension or like traveling down the tension gradient in the behavioral field, then your theory is not really saying anything. You're just saying that people behave in a way that achieves goals, and then we like are turning that into a language of dynamic behavioral field and gradients and so on. But you're just like translating the fact that people try to achieve goals into this language that doesn't actually like add anything to the account in the first place. So you haven't like gained any understanding of goal-directed behavior. You've just sort of like developed a new language that's harder to understand. So the theory is only actually valuable if it doesn't like if not every single form of goal-directed behavior, including the most abstract, sort of like falls under this category or under this form of description, right? Like if your goal of like achieving enlightenment by sitting and meditating is also a minimization of tension, then you haven't really contributed to our understanding of this goal-directed behavior. Yeah, this is a good point from Bats here, that like this sort of depiction of goal-directed behavior as a minimization of tensions sort of presupposes the existence of those tensions in the first place. We need to understand like why is it that this person decides to become a doctor, that they want to become a doctor, or that they want to win the swimming competition or whatever it is, that it's only once this goal is set up in the first place that certain sort of actions or certain environments will have this this behavioral field with tensions. So once I have decided I want to win the swimming competition, then maybe the swimming pool has a sort of attractive value for me, that like my behavioral field is set up in such a way that as I get to the swimming pool, there's like this sort of gradient of reduced tension towards the swimming pool. But of course, I could have decided that I don't care about swimming and I want to play tennis instead, and then it would be the tennis court that would have the attractive value and rather than the swimming pool. And so like what we're interested in the case of organisms that have goals and are capable of realizing goals is like where did these tensions come from in the first place, that like and again this sort of goes back to the discussion in the last chapter of like framing and framed mechanisms, so or framing and framed activities, I guess. So like you can sort of give yourself a set, or you can sort of frame yourself in terms of a goal of, I want to play tennis. And then once you have like set yourself this goal, then you will have like a behavioral field structured in terms of these dynamic tensions and so on, that like, the ball coming towards your side of the court will suddenly have this attractive value, and you will sort of direct your action towards the location where you can hit the ball and return the serve. But if you're just standing there and someone's like chucking tennis balls at you, you won't have the same like sort of like orientation towards the tennis ball and the tennis court and so on. You don't have to play tennis. You can always just not play, right? And so it's only because you have like accepted that you are going to play tennis that the tennis ball has this attractive value for you. And so like it's only once you've sort of framed yourself as a person playing tennis that you sort of exist within that behavioral field with its dynamic tensions. But you can't sort of explain the action by means of which you sort of accept this tennis playing behavioral field itself in terms of sort of another like a meta behavioral field of like choosing whether to play tennis or to go swim or whatever, without again sort of like emptying a theory of any actual content. Oh, and just before you go on, just one a small translation note here. On page 64, there's they use the term monotonous function. The actual term in English is a monotone function. In French, it's the same word, but we have a different word in English. So it's not monotonous in the sense of like boring and repetitive. It's a monotone function means a function such that increases in the domain correspond to increases in the range, right? So if the value of the function on 2 will always be greater than the value of the function on 1, or greater than or equal to the value of the function on 1, for example. So yeah, there's just a slight translation inaccuracy here. 61. Yeah, so for if the function is monotone, you can't have like the function increases from f of 1 is less than f of 2, or f of 2 is greater than f of 1, and then f of 3 would be less than f of 2. You can't have that. You can have a function that's monotone over a certain subset of the domain. So maybe it's monotone the interval, say the closed interval from 1 to 2, but not over the open interval from 2 to 3. But yes, if a function is monotone in general, like not over a specific subset of the domain, but over the domain, then that means that it doesn't decrease as the domain, as the argument of the function increases. But yeah, it's not like super important. It's just a slight translation error here. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. I can read this one. The theory of Leben. Unlike cyberneticians and orthodox gestaltists, Leben, while striving to depict psycho-organic behaviors using vectorial and topological models, did not claim to interpret these schemas as representing physiological reality, the brain field, supposedly isomorphous to the field of behavior. For him, the vectorial and topological model directly and exclusively represents psychological reality. He recognized only that the structure of the brain field coincides with the structure of the space of behavior in its essential traits. But Leben, just like the orthodox gestaltists and the cyberneticians, only insisted more vigorously on the rejection of all psychological explanation, which would appeal to some entities, quote unquote, behind the field of actual processes such as instinct or will. The task of dynamic psychology, he writes, is, quote, to find the psychological laws and to represent the situation in such a way that the actual events can be derived from it, unquote. In that, psychology enables the transition, as the physical sciences did in their time, from the Aristotelian state to the Galilean and Newtonian state. In the epoch of Galileo and Newton, physics changed the meaning of the word, quote, quote-unquote explanation. It rejected theories of the ancient type, which sought explanation not in the relations of dynamic events themselves, but in entities situated behind the event. Leibniz's conception does not essentially differ from that of the cyberneticians and gestaltists. It rests on the same quote-unquote actualist hypothesis. Since Leibniz states these postulates with clarity and precision, it is interesting to examine them with particular care. This will allow us to better define, a contrario, the axiological space. The two postulates that properly represent the life space are as follows. A, the principle of quote-unquote concreteness. Right? Effects can be produced only by what is concrete, i.e. by something that has the position of an individual fact which exists at a certain moment, a fact which makes up a real part of the life space and which cannot be given a definite place in the representation of the psychological situation. Sorry, that was all a quote. I should have mentioned that. Okay. This principle excludes all explanations by development, adaptation, wirkende Seele, tendency, or instinct in its abstract definition. B, the principle of quote-unquote contemporaneity. This results from the preceding principle. Neither a past nor a future psychological event can influence present events. Only the actual can act on the actual. It was typical of the Aristotelian way of reasoning not to sufficiently distinguish historical questions from systematic questions, in contrast to the dynamic mode of explanation of Galileo Newton. As a result, it considered some past or future events as possible causes for present events. Finalist explanations based on future causes, like historical explanations based on past causes, violate the principle of contemporaneity. It's a hard word to say. Okay. Even the experimental psychologists continue to be Aristotelians without knowing it. For example, by appealing to an instinct or tendency aiming towards a future state, such as considering children's play as a sort of practice, one implicitly allows an action of the future. Symmetrically, many theories of the expression of emotions based on phylogenetic identity and not on the similarity of situations postulate, when it comes down to it, that the past acts. They poorly hide this postulate by appealing to memory as the bridge between the past and the present. Leibniz's error is palpable. In favor of the evidence that only the present is actual, actuel, in the two senses of the word, that is, that it takes place now and is acting, we are oblivious to the existence of a quote-unquote dimension, ranging from the ideal to the actual, from the abstract to the concrete, completely independent of the dimension past, present, future. The first postulate is in reality drawn from the second, even though Leibniz believes precisely the opposite. But the axiological space is beyond the time of the physicists as well as beyond their space. If we represent the space-time of the physicist by this schema, a single plane in perspective designating the four dimensions, he refers here to a figure on the page, which, so it shows a sort of past, present, future line with another sort of diagonal dimension of actualization from the ideal to the actual. Okay, so if we represent the space-time of the physicist by this schema, it is clear that neither the past nor the future can be active. But nothing prevents the actual present from being in dynamic equilibrium with a transtemporal and transspatial ideal that would intervene in the circuit of an axiological feedback. When an animal acts by instinct, when it is in the proper sense, quote unquote, overtaken by an instinct, it is not necessary to tie this instinct, as Lamarckism believes, to the history of the species, or as naive finalism believes, to a divine intervention taking into account the future. But it is necessary to take into account something other than the actual present state of the organism, given here and now. The impromptu postulate would rather immediately assume the existence of either an unobservable microstructure in the organism, instinctive activity being only the operation of this microstructure, or a field of forces of the same nature as the fields of attraction and repulsion of Newtonian physics. Okay, I'm going to reach the end of this section here. This is even more apparent if we consider the work of the formative instinct. Principle of concreteness is inapplicable, or more precisely, it becomes insignificant when applied to embryonic development. This development is incomprehensible if we only consider actual functioning or equilibrium. The interpretation according to action of the past, nihilism in the manner of Haeckel, or according to action of the future, naive finalism, may be false, and to a large extent they probably are. But the purely actualist interpretations, that is, those which appeal only to immediate structural or dynamic states, excluding all transspatial potential and all organizing dynamism, are certainly entirely false. Because epigenesis is an experimentally demonstrated fact, while preformationism in all its forms is a hypothesis that has been eliminated. Contrary to the principle of concreteness, there is something behind the actual processes. They are in dynamic interaction not only with each other, but with the formative themes located outside of space-time. Leibniz fails to recognize the primary character of the force in the microphysical or psychobiological individualities. He fails to recognize that the forces of classical physics are merely statistical averages of these primary forces. He gets things wrong by wanting to interpret the dynamism of individual activities according to explanations of the Galileo-Newtonian type. Failing to recognize their primary character, he fails to recognize their true nature. The forces in an individual activity derive directly from the joining end-to-end of the actual with the transspatial temporal. They express the ideal to actual tension. If the forces of physics seem to express actual to actual tensions, it is quite simply because the individual microphysical actions that constitute them are lost and neutralized in the general statistical effect. Nervous feedback seems to function only in the actual and according to tensions which go from actual to actual, but they are enveloped and framed by an ideal to actual tension. And in the case where they are effectively reduced to actual functionings, their assembly at least has been operated by a primary feedback with a transspatial component. Yeah, there's a lot going on in this bit here. So I guess the Nathan theory is sort of like it's not that different really from the Gestalt theory that we've been discussing before. It's maybe just like a more straightforward or a more explicit presentation of the ideas behind this Gestalt theory. This idea that only what is present can act is sort of the core claim of this theory that Ruyer is going to contest, because for him this transspatial sort of orientation of the organism, or this orientation of the organism towards the ideal, is neither spatial nor temporal. So it's not the case that the future is acting on the organism in this sort of naive finalism sense, nor is it the case that the past acts on the organism, but rather we have this non-temporal, non-spatial ideal or axiological space in an extended sense that the organism is sort of situated in, and the organism is always, insofar as we can depict it as reducing tensions, it's always doing so within that axiological space rather than within actual space. So it's not that the organism, we can't understand the organism's behavior in terms of a reduction of tensions in actual space, for all the reasons that we talked about earlier, and just most sort of basically the fact that there is no like physical force acting on the organism to draw it towards the food in the way that there's a physical force acting on the organism to hold it on the ground, for example. So when we describe the organism as being attracted towards the food, it only is attracted towards the food insofar as it has this orientation in axiological space towards things that ensure its survival and ability to reproduce, for example. It is directed towards continuing to exist, using the sort of Spinozistic idea of the conatus. So an organism will try to persevere in being. It will, pursue goals that contribute to its ability to survive and to reproduce. But this sort of orientation towards the goals of surviving and continuing to reproduce is not itself a spatial, field of tensions in the way that heading towards the food source could be represented as. And then we get these sort of glimpses of this even more speculative proposal that he's putting together here. That when we understand physical explanations in terms of like an actual connection from something actual to something else that's actual, this is actually just a sort of statistical presentation of this ideal to actual, over a large assemblage of microorganisms, namely the subatomic particles. So like when we understand the orbits of the planets in terms of these laws, these mechanical laws, we obviously, like, each planet consists of some absurdly large number of particles, and we are not like, we don't try to describe the motion of the planet by predicting the trajectory to those particles, which obviously would be like nowhere near feasible. We instead sort of represent the planet as like one body, sometimes even just as a single point, and then use this very coarse-grained depiction of the matter that makes up the planet to make predictions of its future trajectory. And so by doing this, we're like sort of abstracting away from the individual life course, you can say, of all the particles that make up the planet. And so it's only by virtue of sort of doing this abstraction that we can depict evolution of physical systems in terms of this actual to actual linkage or connection, as opposed to this ideal to actual development, which is what really going on at the fundamental level for Ruyer.
Yeah, there's so much in this section. One thing that I was thinking about is in this rejection of actualism. He rejects actualism, but as you mentioned, he also doesn't think that the transspatial, transtemporal dimension is it's not in the future or in the past. But I am interested to know, I guess just to keep this in mind as we keep reading, whether, the axiological dimension is continuous with respect to like discrete actual moments. So I don't know, in a sense is kind of between them. Or I guess how exactly he understands the relation between a moment of actuality and or I guess a series of actual moments and the axiological dimension.
Yeah, so if I can sort of reformulate if I'm understanding correctly, so like you have like say the behavior of an organism over time, you have time t1 and time t2 in that sort of ongoing behavior of the organism. So is it the case that there's like an axiological space associated with t1 and another axiological space associated with t2, or is it the case that there is like one axiological space within which the organism is situated, and then its behavior in actual space proceeding from t1 to t2 is sort of like I guess associated with a trajectory in this single axiological space. Is that sort of
exactly.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, we'll have to sort of see what we think about that as we go along. But I think he will try to. He doesn't sort of explicitly set this out, I think, but like how I understand it is there's a kind of like almost like a Russian doll kind of setup of like axiological spaces of broader and broader sort of scope, where like if it's something very sort of concrete, like our stock example here of getting a beer from the fridge, you would have this like fairly simple and maybe like even a one-dimensional axiological space of like the orientation towards the beer retrieval is like the only sort of dimension of this axiological space. But then you can also sort of zoom out and see that single dimension of retrieving a beer from the fridge as being like embedded in a broader axiological space of like I don't know achieving a state of pleasant feeling or something. I don't know, putting it in very vague terms. But like you can see how like any sort of more concrete orientation towards a goal can always be sort of embedded in a broader axiological space with like a more like sort of abstract goal, and then sort of maybe at like the most like zoomed out level, you just have like an orientation towards good and aversion towards bad. But so you would have like these sort of subspaces of this broader axiological space that might be associated with specific like behaviors or specific sub goals, and then each of those subspaces would be embedded in a bigger axiological space. But yeah, and that's a good question here, whether it makes sense to suppose that there is like a single largest axiological space that all the other spaces are embedded in. Like is it the case that there is this like sort of single coherent like location of all these different axiological spaces? It's a good question. I don't know if we have an answer to that question, but yeah, we can keep that in mind as we're reading and see if there's anything that helps us to answer that question. I think maybe if we like, insofar as the organism, including a person, ends up doing something, like no matter how sort of conflicted you are, you might like you can think of Greek tragedy type of situations where Antigone has these conflicting obligations to bury her brother or to obey the laws of the city. Ultimately, Antigone does choose to bury her brother. This seems to, like, if we're sort of depicting this situation in terms of this axiological space picture, we seem to have to situate these two sort of almost, in a sense, contradictory obligations as being embedded in a single space, because ultimately she does actually choose between these two obligations. So we have to sort of understand her behavior as being, oriented, having this orientation to within which there is a possible decision between these conflicting obligations. So I think, like, insofar as an organism or a person does end up making a decision or opting for one to achieve one goal versus another one, or to realize a certain value to another one, or could be a compromise between them, or whatever. It doesn't have to be an either or. Like, insofar as there's some sort of outcome of this process, it seems like we need to represent whatever options or goals or ideals are involved in this decision as situated within a single axiological space.
So that relates to another thing I was thinking about in this section is when he talks about the appearance of actual to actual movement as opposed to ideal to actual being true for the molar aggregate, but not necessarily, I guess, at the molecular level. So as I understand it, Ruyer would see, the brain itself, each neuron basically as a kind of primary consciousness. And maybe the, statistical aggregate of neurons would be comprehensible as kind of actual to actual movement, which would, seems like, in a sense, falsify an ideal to actual movement at the level of each neuron, or maybe not falsify, but would not fully capture the ideal to actual movement at the level of each neuron. However restrained the neuron's access to the ideal might be. It's what is unclear to me is how the global personality would relate to the primary consciousnesses of the individual neurons. If he would see it as, I don't know, kind of like nested, like dominating and dominated monads in Leibnizian fashion, or some other way. I don't know if he addresses this in this book, but I guess kind of the composition of primary consciousnesses, if everything is supposed to be a kind of primary consciousness, is a bit mysterious to me.
Yeah, this is one of the sort of the standard objections to any kind of panpsychist or similar type of theory. Often called, like, the compositional objection, or the composition objection, that, like, if you sort of assert that electrons and protons and so on are sort of like have their own inner life, or have something analogous to human consciousness, and then you also accept that a human body is composed of protons and electrons and so on, then it seems like we need to have some sort of account for what the connection between these, like, inner lives of the subatomic particles and our own inner life is. Like, did these inner lives sort of get joined together to produce our inner life as a unified person, or, like, is our sort of the inner life of the person sort of adjacent to the inner lives of all the particles, or whatever? Like, it's hard to sort of like, whatever answer you give, it seems quite it seems arbitrary in a sense. Like, it's hard to see how you could give a good argument for one or the other of these positions. I don't think he really addresses that question in this book. Of course, like, defending panpsychism isn't really the point of this book, though of course he has other books where that's more of the topic. I don't think I've read any of those ones, though. But anyway, I think it's also worth keeping in mind, though, that this sort of ideal to actual versus actual to actual, or we can say like this inner life versus mechanical sort of duality is not is not sort of intrinsic to the entity in question, but it has to do with how it relates to other entities in a sense. So like going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, like the pile of sand, for example, the pile of sand has no intrinsic existence in the sense that there's no inner life of the pile of sand as such. There's no sort of sand entity. But each of the electrons and protons in that grain of sand is an intrinsic existence. It is something that has an inner life for Ruyer. Um, so it's partly just a question of like what scale you're looking at, and then from there, the question, sort of the distinction is not so much is there inner life going on or not, because there's inner life going on everywhere. The question is just is the system that we're looking at organized in such a way as to sort of amplify the having an inner life character of its components, or is it just a sort of aggregate that where all of the sort of inner life aspect gets sort of washed out by this sort of statistical averaging? So like the grain of sand, the pile of sand example, you don't really need to like it doesn't add anything to your understanding of the pile of sand if you sort of attribute an inner life to it, because you can just understand it as this aggregate, and all you really need to know about it is like its mass and I don't know, cohesion and sort of these very basic properties that don't have anything to do with the inner life of the particles that make up this pile of sand. Whereas when you're studying a living organism, like one of the sort of basic themes throughout this book is that you do need to understand the inner life, or this sort of ideal to actual tension or sort of manifestation process going on within the organism to be able even to understand its behavior. And so in this sense, the organism is sort of amplifying this ideal to actual development that is also going on within all the particles that make up the organism, whereas the pile of sand is not amplifying that ideal to actual development. In fact, it's sort of canceling all these different ideal to actual developments going on within the pile of sand are all sort of canceling each other out and just neutralizing to some statistical aggregate property like maths or something like that. But then like to go to the brain example you talked about, like so each neuron would have each of these sort of sides to it. A neuron is a cell that is a living entity. It takes in nutrients. It excretes waste products. It does operations within itself to keep itself alive. And so in that respect, it has this sort of ideal to actual process going on within it. It is a living being in its own right, but at the same time, it is made up of all sorts of like a neuron is not a sort of simple entity. It's made up of all kinds of other things going on within it, including what are quite appropriately described as machines. Like you have all these organelles inside the cell that like transcribe and translate DNA to bring about protein expression and so on. Like all these things are mechanical in Ruyer's sense, and so they're operating at the level of like statistical aggregates. So the neuron is both something that has this for itself intrinsic nature, this sort of ideal to actual development or process going on, but also it's something that is composed of these sort of mechanical components. And then conversely, or like sort of zooming out further or looking at its relation to other neurons, of course, the neuron itself is a component in the brain as a whole, or you can insert more layers. It's a component in some network in the brain, and then that network is itself a component in the brain as a whole. And then even when you're looking at like quite sort of physiological accounts of the behavior of neurons, these are accounts that are not at all presented in terms of this axiological space and realization of an ideal and so on. like just looking at the dynamics of a neuron in terms of the flow of ions across the membrane. So like neurons, produce an electrical a voltage difference across the membrane by taking in and emitting and expelling neurons across ions across the membrane. So charged particles that either flow in or out across the membrane. But even like this accounting for the dynamics of the flow in and out of ions and what that does to the charge of the neuron, like in a single neuron, is quite complicated. And then of course there are billions of neurons in a human brain, all doing these flow in and out of ions all the time. And so any like sort of models of a human brain, or even like a specific sub network within the human brain, with more than a handful of neurons, will involve like radical simplifications of the behavior of neurons, like sometimes even just like the level of like on and off, as opposed to representing the flow in and out of ions. So like already at the level of like a physical description of what's going on in a brain, you're already having to do this sort of aggregation and like abstraction away from the physical implementation details to just to make it like tractable for even like big sort of GPU racks to be able to do these kinds of analyses. Just to be able to depict like the kinds of things that are going on in the brain as a physiological organism, not to mention like the actual sort of cognitive or intellectual operations going on, when we're involved in something like solving a problem, writing a poem, whatever. So yeah, like the sort of statistical aggregation that Ruyer is describing is a very real point in like even quite low level neuroscientific. Okay, so we're approaching a 2-hour mark, and we're at a section break, so I'm going to suggest we stop here instead of going on to the next section. I'm reading a section titled Axiological Relief, and I'm thinking of it as like a kind of medication you would buy at the drugstore. Like, are you having axiological pain? Like, just take this medication to get relief. Which is not at all what he has in mind. But anyway, we'll see that next time. So thanks everyone for discussing today. This is an especially interesting section, I think, that's sort of getting a clearer picture of what his alternative proposal is, or like what he thinks is missing from cyberneticians and the Gestalt theorist accounts. I think we're slowly getting to see more of that as we go along. So thanks everyone, and hope to see you next week.